David Bedford is a Beatles historian. He's written many books. He's produced a movie, Looking for Lennon. He is out of Liverpool, and his thesis is you can't really understand the Beatles until you tour Liverpool. So you get to know Liverpool, to understand what it was like for the Beatles there in Liverpool when they came back from Germany, even before they went to Germany, what it was like for them. We have a great discussion. I am an avid Beatles fan. We get into some of the music. We get a little soccer or football rivalry out of the way, as I am a Manchester City fan, and obviously he is a Liverpool fan. But it's a great discussion on the Beatles. He's got really great stories on what happened with Pete Best, the other drummer, on what happened with their first, how they got their first contract with the producer. Very interesting. Now something happened at the end where it got cut off, so we will have a part 2 to this in the future. But it's a great conversation about the Beatles. Learn some of his. I make the assessment that the White Album should have been one album, and what songs should have been omitted, and we have a little bit of a debate there. But it's a great discussion. David Bedford, Beatles historian. I know you're going to like it. Thanks for listening. Hi, I'm Joey Pinz. People ask me, how did I lose 130 pounds? The quick answer is always discipline. I started my business, wasn't paying attention to my health, was eating too much, drinking too much sweets. My daughter was born. Next thing I know, I'm pre-diabetic. I have hypertension. I knew something had to change. Discipline. I, like many of you, have faced many challenges in your career, in your family, in your life, in your faith. How did you attack them? How did you approach them? How did you solve them, hopefully? It all had to have some degree of discipline. I'm also asked, how did you found and start a tech business? And it lasted over 25 years. Discipline. I was committed to it, enjoyed technology, didn't enjoy some aspects of it, but knew it was necessary. Discipline. Our podcast mission, how do we use discipline to better ourselves and society? Join me, please, as I talk to interesting people and discuss how they use discipline in their family and their passion and their careers and how it helped them. Our podcast vision, growth through learning from others. Joey Pinz Discipline Conversations. It'll be light and serious. Join us, please. Thank you for consideration.
How's life in podcast world then?
Oh, not too bad. I am so excited to talk to you. I've got so many questions. I love your and but I have to ask first right off the bat. I don't know if this is going to influence the rest of our conversation, but I have to be open and honest, 100% honest here. I am a Manchester City supporter.
Good night. You should have closed with that one.
I
You
see.
should. Oh, dear me. You've got so much to learn.
I want to be honest.
You should have lied to me. It would have been fine.
I still enjoy watching Liverpool. I enjoy English Premier Soccer is my favorite, or football is my favorite league, but I do vote for the or support for the citizens.
Okay.
Would the White Album have been better if it was only one album?
Oh, what a wonderful, wonderful idea. Do you know what? It's a strange one because the White Album is bizarre. It's this eclectic mix of whatever was going through their heads at the time. And you think there's some stuff in there that shouldn't really be on there.
Yeah.
But is there enough of that stuff to take off to make into a single album? And there isn't. Revolution 9, experimental, or the song, I call it Skip. Because as soon as I say that one's coming up next, Skip.
Skip it, yeah.
That one, Wild Honey Pie.
Wild Honey Pie. Safri Truffle?
Yeah, it's a bit of an indulgence, mainly because I
Yeah.
love chocolate. So I'll let George off for that one.
The Other Revolution or Revolution?
No,
slow
not
one?
too. I'm good with that. I'm fine
see.
with versions of that one. But yeah, it's a strange album, and probably it's one of the ones I don't listen to very often. But when I go back to it, something actually, there's so many brilliant songs on here.
Absolutely.
How could you? You couldn't make it into a single. It's not possible to be a single album. And yes, there's a couple of indulgences on, but there's so much amazing stuff.
Oh,
They were just writing so many great songs. It's why not stick it in there and go and revisit it, and it's amazing. Every now and again, you just go, Rocky Raccoon. No,
yeah.
am I in the mood? Can I? Can I not? Maybe. Um,
Yeah. Obla
but
di obla da. It's silly. It's
no, I
so
love that
brilliant.
one.
Do you
I
really?
I love that.
It starts with back in the USSR, Glass Onion,
Oh,
it's wonderful.
fabulous.
One of my favorite Beatles songs, very underrated of all time, Martha, My Dear. The beautiful piano into a symphony, which is all Mr. Martin, I'm sure, and just wonderfully brilliant.
Yeah, it's nice, and it's about his dog.
Yes,
That's
it's his
that.
dog Martha.
Yeah.
Yes. Yeah,
Do you ever
Julia,
remember a band called Slade?
of course.
Yep. Well, Slade's first appearance on Top of the Pops over here, they were in jeans, dungarees, very short hair, with fiddle, singing "Martha, My Dear."
Really?
Oh my god! It must be on YouTube somewhere. Honestly, from Slade that we know, with Noddy Holt's amazing voice screeching the
Yeah.
great rock songs. There they are in black and white doing "Martha, My Dear," and yeah, you, you can't believe it when you see it.
Amazing. Oh, I got the vision of, Dexty's Midnight Riders from the '80s. They were kind of similar. They were in the
It was that kind of style of dress exactly. Yeah,
wow. I just remember I was born in the late '60s, so I was born in '68. So I remember I opened up my mother's Sergeant Pepper's when I was about 10, and I just remember opening up and seeing the 4 Beatles and then going through each word in
yeah.
every song and just being mesmerized. This is a chapter, and this is going to change the way I listen to music, and it did for many people.
Well, it did, and I mean, it came out on my second birthday.
Hmm.
Um, Again, that was the Beatles tribute to me. They realised how important I was going to be in their life,
Congratulations.
so they said, here's a birthday present, Dave. You're going to be 2. Have an album, and just to help you learn to read for the first time ever, we're going to print all the lyrics on an album.
That's right.
I mean, that was great. They put little, face masks and stuff in there as well
That's right.
for my party. They're great guys. Uh, but what an album! What an
Mhm.
album! It's phenomenal. And it wasn't intentionally going to be like that, because originally John and Paul had been talking in '66 about doing an album all about their Liverpool childhood. When John had started on In My Life, one of the all-time great songs.
Absolutely.
He started with a list of places he remembered.
That's right.
Penny Lane was one I'm missing. He mentions like the Picton Clock, the Abbey Cinema, all these places he remembered from his bus ride, but he couldn't make it work in a song. So he scrapped it and started again.
Wow.
But that got Paul thinking about Penny Lane. He's thinking, maybe we should write about our childhood. So Paul starts writing Penny Lane. So John starts working on Strawberry Fields Forever.
Huh.
And they were going to carry on writing songs about their Liverpool childhood. Um, Obviously, Penny Lane and Strawberry Fields Forever were put out as a double A side single, and they never had anything on the single on an album. No, what honest, decent chaps they were. You know, that was soon forgotten by everybody else, wasn't it? Here's an album, buy an album, and we're going to release 4 or 5 of the songs on the album as singles. Go and buy that as well, please. The Beatles didn't do that. So Sergeant Pepper, what a fantastic album.
Wonderful.
And
I I don't know, I know that the Beatles did not like the way their albums were published here in the States, because
yeah,
I heard those 2 songs and Blue Jay Way and I Am a Walrus on the other side of Magical Mystery Tour.
yeah, yeah. And see, that's it. It was strange. It was what Capital were doing. No, they're still part of the EMI group. So Parlophone in the UK were putting the album out. This is the album as the Beatles and George Martin wanted it, with the tracks, and musicians will spend a lot of time making sure they get certain songs in the right place. What's
Mm,
going to open side 1, what's
mm,
going to open side 2,
mm.
what's going to follow that. They spend all this time getting all the songs in the right order. And then Capital then put an album out, And instead of being 14 songs like the UK version, there'd be 10. So Capitol could then squeeze another album in. So you had different titled albums to the ones we had. And then there'd be different EPs and stuff coming out. And that really annoyed the Beatles, because they were saying, this was our concept for this album. These were all the tracks we wanted in this order. Why are you doing it? You're butchering our songs. I know. Let's do a butcher cover. And of course, that was the famous, most
Y&T.
controversial,
Yeah,
the
yesterday and
butcher
today.
cover.
Yeah.
Yeah. So, yeah, they were annoyed. And
I mean,
fair enough.
so it's just a money thing is really what it comes down to. They just try to squeeze more money out of, that's what the American.
Surely a record label trying to squeeze everything out of the
I can't
artists
believe it.
and the
60s were so
pundits.
different.
No, yeah, exactly. Yeah, it's never happened before or after, has it?
I can't even listen to A Little Help with My Friends without listening to Sergeant Pepper's before it. I mean, it just goes right, they're one
Exactly.
song in my mind.
Yeah. Well, they are. That was the whole idea. And that comes back to the whole thing of sequencing the
Yeah.
songs on an album. And the idea is that they flow. There's a reason why they're like that. But who are we? What
Yeah,
do we
who are
know?
we?
We're just the public who buys them.
And consume it and change our lives, and you have such
Absolutely.
great stories. You have such great stories. I wanna start with, I mean, you're showing us the actual notes from George Martin for, what was the track? It was for when they first got the 4 track for Help,
Yes.
and it's just an incredible. I watched it more than once. I'm just so enthralled where he says, "This is gonna be on track 1, and I don't wanna take it away from you. Please." I mean, it's wonderful.
Well, it was great. That was in conjunction with the Beatles story, which is a fantastic um, Beatles museum and experience down here in Liverpool, for which I am an ambassador, which I'm very proud
Yes.
of. So sometimes when they got a new exhibit, they ask me to go down and we do some radio and TV work explaining it. And yeah, that they had one of these 4-track machines from EMI. So they had the original thing. And you think how basic this is.
Wow.
You've only got 4 tracks and some of these great songs the Beatles recorded. And for those who don't understand how music works, is you've got to record some of it on the 3 tracks. When you're happy with those, you then have to mix those down onto track number 4, and you've got to get that right, because then you record over tracks 1, 2, and 3, and you keep mixing it down.
Wow.
So you could have 10 or 12 tracks of different things, but you've got to get the mix right every time, because you lose the original. So that's the skill of George Martin and his engineers. And so here we have from George Martin's notebook in his handwriting of like who's playing which instrument on which track.
Yes.
And I'm holding this.
Yeah.
I've got the white gloves on. I'm thinking, this man was an absolute genius.
Yes.
George Martin, the fifth Beatle, he was so much involved in the music. And for everything else that goes on around the Beatles, it's the music that will last forever and ever. And George Martin, I love the photos of him in the studio. You got John, Paul, and George and Ringo all around. And there's George Martin on a stool in the studio
Mm.
talking through how they were going to do the song. He was so much part of that process. And here's his pages in his scruffy handwriting, not realizing how important these notes would be about who was doing what on which track and which guitar and stuff they were playing, and stuff like that. It's absolute gold. And one of the other amazing ones that I did with the Beatles story was the whole reason Brian got in front of George Martin. Because Brian had been to every record company
Yes. I
in
love the
London,
story. Yes.
that they'd all said no, they'd all turned them down. And Brian was running out of ideas. So he remembered a guy that he'd met on a record retailer's get together in Hamburg, in Germany, of all places, where the Beatles found themselves. He was at HMV in London. So Brian goes to see him and says, Bob, I've got these tracks, and they were the demo tapes that the Beatles had recorded at Decca. And of course, they failed the audition.
Mm.
But Decca thankfully gave Brian the tapes. So he said, how can I get these in front of, record producers? And he said, well, you really need to get them onto acetate. That's what people listen to.
Now, acetate is vinyl album.
It's a vinyl album, yeah, and they're made of shellac back then, like the old 78s were and stuff. So the big heavy things.
Wow.
And he said, we've actually got a laser cutting place just above that can transfer your tape onto these acetate discs
In the
for
same
you.
building.
Same building. So Brian goes up and meets this guy, Jim Foy, I think his name was. And so he starts listening to them and putting them onto acetate. And he says to Brian, he said, this is interesting. I've not heard this song before. And Brian said, no, it's an original song. He said, have you got a record deal? Well, no, that's what I'm looking for. Well, also in the building, we've got a company above us called Ardmore and Beechwood, who are music publishers. They might be interested in original music. So with his acetates in the same building, he goes up and he sat down with this guy, Sid, and he's saying, this is what my group are doing. And he said, that's interesting. We could be interested in publishing this. Have you got a record deal? No. Who have you been to see? And he said, I've seen everybody. He said,
right.
I know somebody might be interested in this. His name's George Martin. He's on this little label called Parlophone, who mainly do comedy records, but he's wanting to do something more with rock and roll, etc. Sid sets up a meeting for Brian then to go and see George Martin. Brian then takes these acetates, and George Martin wasn't in the same building. Everybody else was. So he goes over and meets George Martin, plays him the tracks. And George Martin thinks, yeah, that it's okay. But he said he was just so impressed with Brian. He said he had so much enthusiasm. He believed so much in this band. He thought, I'm on the lookout for an act. Maybe. He said, okay, what the heck? Bring him down. I'll put him through an audition in the studio. If it works out, I can offer you a contract. We'll see how that goes. How is that? And they did. And those acetates we thought were lost. And then suddenly, just a few years ago, they turned up in the attic. And it was, it's one of the guys from Jerry and the Pacemakers. So he had the acetate. And so, again, I was called down by the Beatles story. They were putting them on display. And I was thinking, these are some of the most important discs ever created. You've got these, and it was interesting the way Brian had labelled the disc. Paul McCartney and the Beatles one side, John Lennon and the Beatles the other side, because every group tended to be lead singer and the somethings. And I've got these discs in my hand. I'm thinking, you can't really put a price on this. This is so important. These are the acetate discs that George Martin listened to and decided to take a punt on the Beatles. And it's just, and this kind of thing keeps happening over and over again. And I've been doing this for over 20 years now. And there's always something new. No, this is a band that broke up in 1970 when I was 5 years old.
Right.
And there's still something new to learn all the time. I'm very, very privileged. I really am.
And you call that the Holy Grail in your video.
Oh, absolutely. If you're trying to go back, there's only one other disc, I think, which would be more important, which I'm pretty sure has been lost forever. And that was made in Hamburg on the 15th of October, 1960. And that's when Lou Walters from Rory Storm the Hurricanes decided to make a record. He was a ballad singer. Alan Williams, the Beatles manager, said, I'll give you the money. So he called his drummer, who was Ringo Starr, said, let's go and do this. Who's around? Well, John, Paul and George from our mates, the Beatles. I don't think they're doing anything. Oh, we'll drag them down. And they go and they record 3 or 4 songs, like Summertime and Fever. And there's either 1 or 2 discs made. But this is the very first time John, Paul, George, and Ringo appear on a record together,
Hmm.
nearly 2 years before Ringo joins the Beatles.
Wow.
And those discs were lost years ago. I don't think we'll ever find they really would have come up somewhere by now. But that would be the absolute ultimate. But on the basis, I don't think we've got photos of it. I don't think we'll ever hear that. But the acetates that Brian gave to George Martin that got them the record deal. It's just it's holding a piece of history. It's fabulous.
Incredible. So that's a very cool segue now to Pete Best, and you tell a great story because Pete Best was an actual partner with the Beatles, and the rest of the John, Paul, and George didn't want him. They thought he was good in concert, but not for the studio, or live, but not in the studio. Please tell the story and how they asked him to leave, not them, but the producer. It's a very interesting story.
Well, it is, and it's like the biggest Beatles mystery, and
Hmm.
it's been like this since 1962, when Pete was called in by Brian Epstein, and he was told, the other lads want you out, and it's already been arranged. Ringo's joining on Saturday, so Ringo joins 18th of August 1962. On the 4th of September, a couple of weeks later, they're down at Parlophone starting to work on the first record. So Ringo was there right at the end. There's so many stories that have been put out over the years. The most common one, and I get into this debate on social media a number of
Hmm.
times, because people say to me, "Oh, Pete Best was a crap drummer." I say, "Okay, what are you basing this on?" And then they come out with whichever myth or story they've heard. And there's a lot of them that peddled by some quite well-renowned historians who have their own agenda, and I like to be very, very objective with these things. And I'm thinking, well, first of all, no, I'm a musician. I play guitar, I play keyboards, I play bass. I can't play drums. Um, I played a marching snare drum in the boys' brigade when I was little. I can keep a beat. I can't play a drum kit. So I have admiration for drummers anyway. So I was thinking all the time, I kept coming up against this whole thing. Pete Best was a crap drummer, and they'd always loved Ringo. So it was just a matter of time that they thought, oh, now's the time. Let's switch them over. And that's not based in evidence,
Hmm.
and it's not based in eyewitness testimony either. It's based in, I call it sort of the cuddly Disney Fab Four mop top version of Beatles history. And it's sweet and it's lovely. And it's like a fairy story.
Easy to
And eventually,
remember.
yes, and Ringo comes along and suddenly. Now, I will say that the book that I did a few years back called Finding the Fourth Beatle is all about finding the drummer, and when Ringo joins, you know, that does make the difference. And no other drummer could have done what Ringo did. And I really fight his corner. He is such a fantastic drummer who doesn't get the credit he deserves. But how he joined and how Pete left has been this big mystery, which has been like a cover up. And I finally worked it out. And the way I worked it out was I interviewed Brian Epstein's lawyer,
That's right.
because it comes down to the law. Now, in my earlier life, before I became an author, etc., I worked for an insurance company, and I did qualifications in English law and contract law. So that comes up every now and again. So I know how contracts work. So I was talking to Brian's lawyer, and I'd spoken to another lawyer in the same firm who it turns out had acted for John, Paul, George, and Pete. So when
Hmm.
Brian was getting his first contract information and advice from one lawyer, John, Paul, George, and Pete went to somebody else in the same firm to get advice from them, because obviously the one lawyer couldn't advise both Brian and the Beatles. So it turns out this first lawyer, Eric, drew up a partnership agreement between John, Paul, George, and Pete Best at the end of 1961. Now, this is the time where a lot of the myths say that the Beatles were wanting to get rid of Pete. Well, that doesn't work. If they're signing a partnership agreement to say, we are the band, we do things together, they weren't looking to get rid of him. So that's a myth. So when I then interviewed Brian's lawyer, David Harris, he then talks to me about the advice he gave to Brian. And what the evidence says is, after that audition that George Martin gave to the Beatles on the 6th of June 1962, at the end of it, George Martin says to Brian, okay, I don't mind what you're going to do with the group. If we come down to making a record, and it was still a big if at that time, if we come down to making a record, I'll bring in a session drummer. Now that was quite normal practice back then. There's a lot of the big bands who came out of Britain in the 60s. Occasionally, none of them would play their own instrument. They would be session musicians. So that was normal practice. But Brian was a record retailer. He knew nothing about the recording industry. He goes to John Paul and George and says, if we get the record contract, it's up in the air at the moment, but if we get it, he doesn't think Pete's good enough to play on the record. And at which point, and Paul is quoted as saying, and we think, what do we do about this? This is our last chance of getting a contract. Pete's great, when we're playing live in the halls and the clubs, etc. But if George Martin doesn't think he's good enough to play on the record, we're going to have to get another drummer. Now, they do nothing, but Brian speaks to his lawyer and he says, can I just get rid of Pete Best? John Paul and George have asked me to get rid of him. And he said, well, you can't just do that because they're a partnership in law. And in English law, you cannot sack one of your partners. You have to disband the partnership, draw up the accounts, share out the proceeds, and then you start a new contract. The problem is, by the time George Martin confirmed they had a contract, that was the end of July. They were running out of time. So suddenly you think, okay, we've got to replace Pete. Did they go and ask Ringo? Well, no, they didn't. So they asked a guy called Bobby Graham. He ended up being probably the most successful session drummer that Britain ever had. He played on about 50 number one singles for groups like the Dave Clark Five, the Kinks, etc., Tom Jones. Very experienced. Was playing with a group called Joe Brown and the Brothers, top British act at the time. Brian said, do you want to come to Liverpool and join my group, the Beatles? And he thought, why would I give up this amazing career based in London to go to Liverpool, which might have been on another planet as far as they were concerned, to a group who are only just getting a record contract? So Bobby Graham turned him down straight away. He then goes to another guy called Richie Galvin, fantastic drummer, again, local band. He just got married. He was settling down. He was still semi-professional. Didn't want to give that up. Didn't get on with John Lennon, which is sort of a recurring theme all the way through their career. He was not the easiest guy to get on with.
Right.
So Richie Galvin turned him down. So then it comes to Ringo and Johnny Hutchinson. And how Ringo told it, I found an interview he gave in November 1962. So this is before they were famous. He said, George came to my house, said, come down and see the group on the Saturday. I went down. John Paul and George took me to meet Brian. He offered me the role. He said, I'll ring you on Tuesday, which he did. The Wednesday, they get rid of Pete. The Saturday, Ringo joins them. It all happened in a week. Not quite as fairy tale as everybody thinks it was. So what happens with Pete? They've got a problem because legally they can't sack him. They cannot fire him. And the light bulb moment for me was talking to Brian's lawyer, and he was saying, but of course you have to understand the legal relationship. The Beatles employed Brian. Brian did not employ the Beatles. Brian has no authority to make any changes to the lineup. That's down to the others. He had to carry out the wishes of the Beatles. So John Paul and George say to Brian, you go and do the dirty work. You've got to tell Pete he's out. And of course, he can't just sack him. Now, so what we've known from 62, what Pete Best has said, what Brian has said is exactly the same. He goes into the office. Brian's a nervous wreck. Now we understand why, because he has to get the wording right. He has to convince Pete that he's being sacked without sacking him. So he says to him, right, Pete, the boys want you out. In law, your fellow partners want rid of you from the partnership, from the group. And then he says, and it's already been agreed that Ringo is going to join them on Saturday. Now, you're Pete, you're 21 years old, with no legal background or understanding. That is just a different way of saying you're sacked.
Right.
But because the management contract that Brian had with each of the Beatles individually, Brian still was responsible for finding work for Pete. So he says, well, why don't you join this new band, the Mersey Beats? But they were a couple of youngsters. He thought, no. Brian then speaks to his mate, Joe Flannery, a fellow promoter, who was putting a new group together, Lee Curtis and the All-Stars. Joe Flannery asked Pete to join him. When Pete says, yes, I'll join that group, legally, Pete quits the partnership of the Beatles by joining the other group. So Pete was tricked into thinking he'd been sacked. And to this day thinks that he was sacked, but he wasn't. It was a trick. They had to legally get him out. And the problem was then, when Pete did go and get legal advice, he was given the wrong legal advice. And his lawyer tried to sue Brian for wrongful dismissal. But Brian didn't employ him. So he couldn't have been wrongfully dismissed.
Wow.
So all of this is what I spend my hours doing. You know, ever since I started really digging into Beatles history 20 years ago, this was the thing that had always bugged me. And I'd interviewed Pete in my first book, Liverpool, and he loved the book so much he actually wrote the foreword to the book. And he's a lovely guy. And I've seen him play, and he's a top drummer. You know, he can still play drums. And I thought, oh,
Are you back?
right, I think I'm back. Yeah, we're back. Sorry about
Okay.
that. Internet
You
just
fell
suddenly went.
play. Yeah, it happens.
So
Yeah.
I'd seen Pete play, so I knew he was a good drummer. But because all the official history and the stories were put out, Pete can't play drums. I thought, well, how do I deal with that objectively? Because I'm not a drummer. I can't say, well, yes, he can. So my theory is, if you're writing about Pete Best and whether he's a good drummer or not, if you're not a drummer, I'm already questioning whether you're qualified to make that statement. But I thought, I've got to get around this somehow. So if I'm telling the story of the drummers and Pete being, they're part of the Beatles for 2 years, the formative years, the band that made it in Hamburg, that got the recording contract, that got the contract with Brian as manager. Why was he there for 2 years? If he couldn't play drums, then John, Paul and George would have got rid of him a long time ago.
Right.
But they never did. So what I did was I went to 3 different drummers. One guy who was around the 60s and saw the Beatles with Pete and Ringo and was a drummer. Another guy of my age who's been a drummer, but plays bass, guitars, played in bands all his life. And his son, who had just qualified after doing a degree in music in Liverpool, and again was a really good drummer. And I played them recordings of Pete, which they'd never heard. And I said, you tell me your opinion. Okay, listen to that and you tell me what you think of Pete as a drummer. I was amazed at the feedback that I got from them as to how good they thought he was. They were saying, his variations were good. If you listen to the drumming on My Bonnie, he was asked, and people think, oh no, Bert Camford said, Pete, you're no good at playing drums. I'm taking these drums away. Just play that. It wasn't. Bert Camford never played with a rock and roll drummer. He said, All I want is your snare and your cymbal. You listen to the drumming on that. The drum rolls at speed in perfect timing that Pete Best does are phenomenal.
Hmm.
So I've got drummers telling me that Pete was a really good drummer. So I'm thinking, okay. And a lot of fans don't want to hear that. It's one of those where you take sides
Hmm.
and said, well, I love Ringo, so I know I can't like Pete. I'm saying, no, no, no. Like them both. What Pete did with the Beatles, that's when John said, if you never heard the Beatles in Liverpool and Hamburg, at that time, you never saw the real Beatles. Well,
Hmm.
that was with Pete. But that was when they were pure rock and roll covers band. They were becoming a completely new group. And my argument is when Pete left, that was the end of the Beatles as the local people knew it. And it was the birth of the Fab Four,
Hmm.
who were a pop group who were really there to record their own music. And for that, Ringo had a better skill set than Pete did because of the variety of groups that Ringo had been in. He was better equipped to adapt to the studio and to work with John, Paul, and George. So I say, please don't discredit Pete because what he did was so, so important. And he was a really good drummer for what they were doing. But also, don't write off Ringo. Other drummers say they became drummers
Oh
because
yeah.
of how he played.
Yeah.
He was just the perfect foil for the other three. And the chemistry was right for the group that they became. So, like them all, it's not a problem. And so,
Yes,
yeah, I'm on my
no,
soapbox.
yeah. It's amazing when you talk to drummers or hear drummers, their favorite drummers, how often Ringo comes up to this day.
Absolutely. Yeah.
Is a drummer's drummer. I mean, it's hard because you're behind perhaps the greatest writing duo of all time. So,
Yeah.
it's a big shadow there. So your main thesis, David, is that to understand the Beatles, you have to come to Liverpool. You have to see where they grew up. And one such evidence of that is the Casbah, right? It's not
Yes.
wasn't a pub. They didn't serve alcohol. It's mainly Coca-Cola, if I remember, but they
Yeah.
performed there.
Yeah. The Casbah Coffee Club, I argue, is the birthplace of the Beatles.
Hmm.
And this was set up by an incredible lady called Mona Best, who was Pete Best's mum.
Hmm.
And in 1959, she decided to turn the basement of her house. I mean, it was a really, really big house, to turn that into a coffee bar, into a little club where Pete and his mates could come and the kids could come and bring their records and listen to them in a nice, safe environment. So yeah, it was nothing. Alcohol didn't feature in most of the clubs around Liverpool. It really didn't. The Cavern, places like that. It was all about Coca-Cola or tea or coffee. It was about the music. And Mona created this incredible club, which she called the Casbah Coffee Club. And the group that opened it were the Quarrymen, which were John, Paul, George, and a guy called Ken Brown. And I mean, the story's incredible. She placed her money and her jewelry on a horse in a horse race. And the horse was called Never Say Die. And it came in at 100 to 1 in the Derby in 1954. And she got all this money.
Wow.
She could pay off some debts and she could buy this amazingly big house. And so she turns the basement into this coffee club. And because it was school holidays, when John and Paul come down for the first time and are introduced to her, because the group had split up, George was in another group.
Hmm.
George actually gets John and Paul back together and reforms the Quarrymen. And Mona says, well, if you've got nothing to do, um, here's a paintbrush. Get
Here's
painting.
the stars. Yeah.
Yeah, so you got the stars. You got one whole ceiling called the Aztec ceiling, hand painted by John 3 times over because he did it wrong twice. You got a smack over the head for his trouble. You got a painting there, that one ceiling in rainbow stripes, which Paul did. George and Pete and Stu Sutcliffe. And again, the Casbah is where Stu was convinced to buy a bass and join the group.
Hmm.
So She opened this club, and because they'd seen Pete Best playing, when they, at the 11th hour, they got this gig to go to Hamburg in August 1960. They had a drummer called Norman Chapman, really good drummer. About a week before they're due to go to Hamburg, he gets his call-up papers and has been conscripted to join the army for 2 years. So they got, what do? We need a drummer. We remember Pete up at the Casbah. Ring him up, Pete, you fancy coming to Hamburg? They did like an audition on the Saturday, a rehearsal cum gig on the Sunday. By the Tuesday, they were going to Hamburg. Hamburg is what made them.
Wow.
But then there's chaos in Hamburg when they upset the club owner. George is deported for being under 18. The guy alleged that Paul McCartney and Pete Best had tried to burn his club down, which he hadn't. But they get arrested. They get deported. John comes home. Really, at the end of 1960, that could have been the end of the Beatles. But Mona has got the Casbah, and she said, no, come and play here. So really, the first place they play as the Beatles, this amazing rock and roll group, because when they left, they were nothing. They had a terrible reputation. And they were billed as the Beatles direct from Hamburg. And the people at Casbah thought, oh, we got a German group? And then, of course, in walks John, Paul and George. Say, hang on, they're the Quarrymen. And then Pete walks in. He lives here. They're definitely not German. And then they borrowed a guy called Chas Newby from Pete's old band, the Blackjacks, to play bass. Because Stuart Sutcliffe had stayed in Hamburg. So that's when, at the end of 1960, the Beatles were unleashed on Liverpool. Nobody had seen or heard anything like them. They were just amazing. That's what made them. And the Casbah was so important. And Mona then starts promoting them. And during 61 is acting like their manager until Brian takes over. She got them into the Cavern. So she was an incredible lady who often gets overlooked. And the Casbah is still there. The club shut in 62. So you can go in there and you can touch the ceiling that John Lennon painted and the one that Paul painted. I mean, there's nowhere like it for Beatles fans anywhere on this planet. You've got to come. And that's why I wrote the first book, because I was reading books and these authors are writing about my city and they're making stuff up. I'm thinking that this isn't right. You know, stop telling your stories and just making up little bits about Liverpool. And so really out of anger and passion, I thought, I've got to put this right somehow, not knowing where it was going to end up. And it ends up, the book comes out in 2009, and suddenly, you know, as you quote, you know, to understand the Beatles, you've got to understand Liverpool.
Yeah.
I thought, I've got to tell the Liverpool story. And this just then, it got picked up. And the last, 12 years, my life has been a bit of a whirlwind. I've written more books. You know, I've done a documentary film, got others in planning. I've made trips to the US, to Beatles conventions. I've done all this kind of stuff, none of which I ever thought would happen at all. It was, I just have this passion as a historian for getting stuff about my city right and stuff about the Beatles right, of saying, yeah, we know what happened when they were the Fab Four. So much happened before that. This is the story. And again, as you can see, I'm quite passionate about it.
Certainly are, and you've got a lot of great content. Have you seen McCartney 1, 2, 3 with Rick Rubin going through some of the songs with Paul?
No, I've not got that over here yet. But
It's
I've got friends
unbelievable.
in America who've seen it.
Yeah, wonderful. And then, of course, Peter Jackson's coming out with like a 6-hour documentary on the Beatles soon, very soon, right?
Yes, yeah. This is one that is one of Paul's ideas of trying to projects to keep all the Beatles interested. And it was, let's film how they make the album, which end up, you know, as Let It Be. And there were hours and hours of stuff. And there's been a version out years ago. There's been bootleg versions of other stuff, but it's just been laying there. And for years and years, as fans were saying, no, you've got to give us something from this. And I think we've all got the impression that they spent their time fighting, Whereas from what Peter Jackson's been saying, and some of the stuff Paul's been saying as well, I think we're going to look on those last couple of years before they split up in a very different way. And Peter Jackson's a fantastic director.
Yes.
His Lord of the Rings trilogy
Yeah.
was fabulous. I don't know if you'd seen the one he did on the First World War.
I did
Uh,
actually.
oh my
Yeah.
goodness, that he transformed that into HD. It was
Yes.
absolutely
Wonderful.
beautiful. So I am really looking forward to that. That is going to be good. It really is.
It's always amazing to me when I think about, Let It Be and even the White Album, about how many songs George Harrison did and ended up going on, All Things Must Pass, and they were actually recorded together. I mean, so
Yeah,
some brilliant songs that Paul and John just said, "No, you can't have, oh my goodness, so many songs there." And it's always amazing to me what I think George became a better writer through those 2, and you have these
yeah,
great session musicians, even like Billy Preston, who's there for
yeah,
all that time during Let It Be, who might even be at that time might have been known as a 5th Beatle, who knows? I mean, he was just so integral to what they
yeah,
did.
yeah. And I think that was one of the reasons why, in a way, they had to split up.
Hmm.
I mean, it had got quite acrimonious, and by the time they were recording, Abbey Road, as the last album, even
Yeah.
though there's stuff that's come out and saying that they were still thinking about making another album and carrying on, it was very rare over those last 2 years that all four of them were in the studio at the same time.
Right.
They were off, they had their own little projects, and of course, obviously, they were getting married, starting families,
Mhm.
and there were lots of distractions going on. And a lot of people have speculated, say, well, what if they didn't break up, but they decided to do solo projects, and then every couple of years come back together and do a
Hmm.
Beatles album? And people have speculated, and they've actually drawn up, well, let's take the best off, this solo album, that solo album, and make a new Beatles album, um, which would have been absolutely ideal. The problem
Hmm.
was the relationships had broken down, and all this time, George, who hadn't written a song when the Beatles were starting to record, and was sort of getting encouraged, by the time you get into their last album together, Abbey Road, his songs are equally as good
Absolutely.
as anything Lennon and McCartney did. While my guitar gently weeps, something, here comes the sun. You, those songs are some of the greatest the Beatles ever recorded.
Absolutely.
And we know how much he had in him, because as you say, out comes a triple album,
Right.
All Things Must Pass. He had all these songs.
Oh,
And, what other group can survive that, where you've got three great musicians, three great songwriters, all producing? And of course, don't forget, they gave away a lot of
right.
original songs to
They
other
certainly
artists as well. They just had so much creativity. And I think so much had been squeezed out of them that they needed to just go and find some space somewhere. And they were, as many people have said. I remember interviewing May Pang, who, of course, was John's girlfriend for a time in the 70s, and saying they were brothers. Said when they were together, said we take a step back. Said, and she saw, some angry words exchanged between them, but they were family. That's what
Hmm.
siblings do.
Yeah.
You have fallouts, you get back together, um, and it's a once in a lifetime where you've got that much talent all in one group. It's it's phenomenal. That's why you know they broke up in 1970 when I was 5. And you were even younger,
Yeah.
and yet here we are, decades later. We're still talking about them
It is
because
amazing.
it's a moment in time.
No other band do we ever talk about this much. We don't know that much about the Rolling Stones. We don't know that much about the Kinks as we do the Beatles. Why is that?
Do you know what? I've had this conversation with a number of people. One of them was the guy Mervyn who used to run the Beatles story, and we used to sit down and we'd chew the fat. And that was one of those things. He's running the Beatles story. They were getting over 300,000 visitors a year,
Hmm.
right? And he was saying, why isn't there a Rolling Stones story?
Yeah.
And first of all, we said, there's not really a story. But secondly, everything they did was second to the Beatles. So the Beatles were the innovators. They followed. They did their own thing. And, they tried to create this rivalry between the Beatles and the Stones. They're trying to outdo each other. They were really good mates.
Right.
They were great friends. Now, the Stones' first hit was I Want to Be Your Man,
Hmm.
a Lennon and McCartney song, which
Yeah.
Ringo sang on the album. That was their first hit. Mick and Keith started writing songs because they saw Lennon and McCartney writing songs. So anybody who, we remember, in the Olympics, or soccer, obviously, we can remember the amazing time 2 years ago when Liverpool, they won the Champions League, the European Super Cup, the World Club Cup,
Right.
and then the Premier League. And no other team had done that. That is just phenomenal. But for each of those things, do we remember the runners up?
Hmm.
Now, obviously, in the league, I can remember the runners up. There's
Sure.
a certain team from Manchester, um,
Who's the current English
Sissy.
Premier champion, by the way? The current.
Yeah,
Not
yeah,
the
nobody's
current.
interested in that. No, we're talking history. We're not
I see.
interested in that.
I see. I see.
But unless you got that passion, people remembered the winners,
Yeah.
and the Beatles were at the forefront of absolutely everything.
Absolutely.
They opened the floodgates. It's funny. I was having this conversation with one of my daughters today. I'm saying, when they release "Love Me Do," this new idea of a band being three guitars and drums,
Hmm.
that wasn't a thing.
Hmm.
No, the guy at Decca famously said to Brian, um, "We're not going to take on the Beatles. Groups with guitars are on the way out." Well, groups with guitars hadn't arrived
Wow.
yet. It wasn't a thing.
Wow.
Apart from the Shadows as Cliff Richard's backing band, there weren't guitar groups. They were the first. Suddenly, you got this group who not only had three lead singers, amazing harmonies, but they were writing their own songs. That changed everything. And virtually any artist since 1962 has to thank the Beatles, because up to that point, if you were a good singer, a record label signed you. They put together some session musicians as a backing band. They went to see some songwriters and got a song and said, "Sing that. There's your hit." Suddenly, you don't need that anymore
Hmm.
because you've got a group, self-contained, writing and performing their own songs. That changed absolutely everything. Then you get all these amazing groups that follow, with the Stones, the Who, the Kinks, Dave Clark 5, all these amazing artists. It changed how we do pop music, and whatever fads have come and gone, and there's been plenty of them all the way through since 1962. You've had guitar-based bands
Yeah.
as being popular. It and that with singer-songwriters, it is thanks to what the Beatles did.
I've heard the theory that the Beatles and even the Rolling Stones have created the blueprints of bands, where in the Rolling Stones, there's like the strong front man, always vocals. You could think of Aerosmith. You could think of plenty of examples, and then you have the
Yep,
Beatles, where there's two songwriters, and they could maybe Oasis, and where they kind of go back and forth. And every band since then, you can put in those two categories.
yep, yeah, exactly. And it gave license to all these people who were writing their songs and thinking, well, what can I do?
Hmm.
Because people want to hear covers. So that's all the Stones were doing.
Right, first
They
album.
loved their blues and their
Yeah.
R&B, but they were just playing covers, paying tribute to all those amazing American musicians, the music they loved, but nobody was going to give them a recording contract. But then they see Lennon McCartney, think, hang on, you're writing your own songs and recording them. We must start writing our own songs.
Mm.
And they're the groups that survived, where other sort of Liverpool groups like Jerry and the Pacemakers, had some amazing hits, and had a few original songs, but that was all. Once that dried up, they couldn't go any further. The bands that survived were writing and performing their own material.
Hmm.
And all that is down to what the Beatles did and the vision of George Martin to let them go and be themselves.
Amazing. Yeah, George Martin was I mean, I think of like Eleanor Rigby.
Yeah.
I mean, is that 99% George Martin? I mean,
It's one of only two Beatles songs when none of the Beatles play any instrument on.
let me think of the other one. Tomorrow Never Knows? No. Let me think of another. What would the other be? Well, Revolution Number 9? That doesn't count. Where the Beatles don't play. Uh, oh my god.
Think of it again, similar style to Eleanor Rigby.
Oh my goodness, Not Your Mother Should Know, not not Penny Lane? Full musicianship. I can't think of it. You stumped me, David.
She's Leaving Home.
She's leaving home, of course. Of
It's all
course.
just orchestration.
It's all
The strings,
orchestration.
like Eleanor Rigby is.
That's right. There's no drums, there's no percussion, there's no guitar. Yeah, yeah.
Yeah.
What a beautiful song. She's
Oh,
leaving home.
it's an amazing song, and the fact it's so much based on a true story. And again, that was the genius of what they were doing. They were seeing things in the news and writing about them and applying them
Mm,
to their lives. And that's where, like with Eleanor Rigby, or She's Leaving Home, they come up with the melody, they come up with the lyrics, they've got the song. And this is where particularly Paul McCartney comes into his own. He'd been brought up by his dad, Jim, who was a great musician,
right.
and he played records to Paul and saying, now listen to this, now listen to the strings, listen to the harmony, there's the melody, there's the brass, there's the woodwind, there's the rhythm. In his head, he could hear all these things, but of course he couldn't write music.
Mm,
So he would go to George Martin and say, I've heard this thing, a piccolo trumpet, said it's fantastic.
that's
I
right.
think that'll work well in Penny Lane. And George Martin would then have to take what was coming out of their minds and write it down,
Right.
and then come up with an arrangement and then get the musicians in to do it. It's amazing. It's just
It really
uh,
is. Right after She's Leaving Home, is it getting better every time? Is it getting better? Is that right after that in Sergeant Pepper? I believe.
I think so. Yes.
It's just and from that musicality to that almost reggae fast beat song, I mean, it's such a transition, and it's so welcoming, and it's so refreshing, and it's so
Yeah.
revolutionary.
Yeah.
It's incredible, and I could see Paul saying, "Hey, getting better over time," and I could see John saying, "Well, it couldn't get any worse," and I could
Yeah.
just see those 2 going back and forth.
And that
It's
that sums
wonderful.
them up perfectly,
Perfectly.
because Paul's got this optimism,
It's
and John
oh,
wants to come with a mixture between realism and fatalism,
right.
of saying, yeah, he'd grown up with a lot of tragedy in his
Yes.
life.
Mother
He was taken away
died.
from his mum when he was 5.
Yeah, yeah.
He gets close to his Uncle George, who's like his father figure, because he didn't really have a relationship with his dad. Uncle George dies when he's 14. He gets close again with his mum, who then dies when
Dies,
he's
yeah.
17. And then Stuart Sutcliffe becomes like a brother to him, who drops dead at the age of 21.
Mm,
John, by the time the Beatles are starting to become famous, thinks people who get close to me die.
right.
And one of those amazing things, when I was helping make the documentary Looking for Lennon,